Most people hate working the night shift. The long hours, the silence, and the feeling that the rest of the world is asleep while you're stuck under fluorescent lights. It gets to you. But for Andrew, who worked as the night manager at a small fast food chain, the shift had always been easy money. The store sat in a quiet part of town, and usually after 11 p.m., customers were rare. By midnight, he was often the only one in the building, cleaning up and waiting for closing. But one night, things didn't feel normal. The air felt heavier somehow, and even though the store was empty, Andrew kept catching glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye. He brushed it off as being tired until around 2 a.m. when the bell above the entrance chimed. A man walked in, tall, thin, and pale, dressed in clothes that looked worn and outdated. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, and he never broke eye contact with Andrew as he made his way to the counter. At first, Andrew tried to play it off with his usual customer service smile, but the man didn't speak. He just stood there, staring. The silence stretched on uncomfortably until Andrew finally asked if he could take his order. That's when the man smiled, and in the stillness of the empty restaurant, Andrew realized he wasn't sure if the man had ever even blinked. Andrew shifted uneasily behind the counter. The man's smile was wide, frozen in place, and his eyes never left Andrew's. The silence dragged on for what felt like minutes before the stranger finally spoke. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. "Coffee?" Andrew nodded quickly, grateful just to hear words. He poured the man a cup of the stale late-night brew and slid it across the counter. The stranger didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, studying Andrew the way one might examine an insect under glass. Finally, he picked up the cup, raised it to his lips, and sipped. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2:15 a.m. Andrew was counting down the minutes until closing, telling himself he'd laugh about this later. When the man finally turned and walked to a corner booth, he sat with his back perfectly straight, coffee steaming in front of him. But he didn't drink. He just sat there, watching. Andrew tried to stay busy, wiping down tables and checking equipment, but every time he glanced toward the booth, the man's eyes were fixed on him. At one point, Andrew ducked into the back for supplies. When he returned to the dining area, less than 30 seconds later, the booth was empty. The coffee cup sat untouched, steam still curling upward. Andrew froze. The bell above the door hadn't rung, meaning the man hadn't left. Slowly, he scanned the restaurant. Empty tables, empty booths, no one by the counter. Then he noticed the reflection in the glass of the front door. The man was standing directly behind him. Andrew spun around so fast he nearly slipped, but the space behind him was empty. His pulse thundered in his ears. He walked through the dining area, into the bathroom, and even outside to check the parking lot. Not a single trace of the customer. The lot was barren. No cars but his own. Back inside, Andrew tried to calm down. He convinced himself he was exhausted, his mind playing tricks. He dumped the untouched coffee and returned to his cleaning, but the unease lingered. At 2:45 a.m., the bell above the door chimed again. Andrew looked up, expecting maybe a late-night straggler on their way home. But his blood ran cold when he saw the same man, pale, tall, and smiling, walking back inside as if he had never left. This time, Andrew noticed something he hadn't before. The man's clothes weren't just outdated. They were stained, dark patches around the sleeves and collar that looked an awful lot like dried blood. The man sat at the same booth without saying a word. Andrew's hands shook as he pretended to clean behind the counter, trying not to look at him. But when he finally glanced up again, the booth was empty once more. Only this time, the coffee cup was gone too. Andrew's nerves were shot. He knew he wasn't imagining it. Someone couldn't just appear and disappear like that. He locked the front door, deciding to close up early. But as soon as the deadbolt clicked, the lights above him flickered. The dining area went dark for less than a second But when they came back on, Andrew felt his stomach drop. The man was back. He was sitting at the booth again, the coffee cup in front of him. Only this time, he wasn't smiling. His face was blank, his pale eyes fixed on Andrew, with something far colder than before. Andrew stumbled backward toward the kitchen, gripping his phone. But when he unlocked the screen to call 911, the man stood up. His movements were slow at first, measured. He placed one hand on the table, pushing himself up with deliberate care. Then, without warning, he lunged. Andrew bolted through the swinging doors into the kitchen, his shoes slipping against the greasy tile. He could hear the bell above the counter rattle violently as the man shoved through after him. Andrew grabbed a knife from the prep station, holding it out with shaking hands. "Stay back!" he shouted, but his voice cracked. The kitchen was silent, except for his heavy breathing. For a moment, Andrew thought maybe he'd lost him, until he heard the sound. A low chuckle. The man's voice was closer than it should have been, like he was whispering directly in Andrew's ear. "You shouldn't be here." Andrew spun around, knife raised, but no one was behind him. He staggered backward, his pulse racing, until the knife slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor. Then came the sound of footsteps, fast, heavy, circling him. But no matter which way he turned, the kitchen was empty. The lights flickered again, plunging him into complete darkness for several seconds. When they snapped back on, the man was standing just inches away. Andrew screamed, stumbling backward into the freezer door. The man didn't move closer. He just stood there, smiling again, his pale face inches from Andrew's, the smell of something rotten clinging to him. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. The lights stopped flickering. The kitchen was empty. The front door was still locked, and Andrew was left alone, shaking, gasping for air, and realizing the man had never used the door to come or go. Andrew didn't finish his shift that night. He grabbed his keys, left the restaurant in disarray, and sped home without looking back. The entire drive, he checked his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the pale man sitting in the back seat. But the road stayed empty. The next morning, he tried to explain what happened to his boss. She was sympathetic, but skeptical, reminding him that long nights and too much caffeine could play tricks on the mind. When Andrew insisted it was real, she mentioned something strange. Years ago, another night manager quit. Suddenly, after claiming to see a man who wouldn't leave, Andrew never returned for another shift. He left the job within the week, but he could never shake the feeling that the pale man hadn't been tied to the restaurant. Because a few nights later, long after he thought he was safe, Andrew woke up in his apartment to a sound that made his blood run cold. The soft jingle of a bell, exactly like the one above the restaurant door, echoed faintly from his living room. And when he stepped into the darkened hall, his coffee table was no longer empty. A steaming cup sat there, untouched. Hospitals are unsettling even during the day. The sterile halls, the smell of disinfectant, the echo of distant voices and machines. But at night, they become something else entirely. Quiet, empty, almost abandoned. For nurses working the graveyard shift, it's a kind of silence that can play tricks on the mind. Emily had been a nurse for almost 4 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Trauma cases, grieving families, strange patients muttering nonsense. But nothing unnerved her, like working the night shift in her hospital's old wing. Most of it wasn't used anymore, except for storage. Still, once in a while, staff had to go down there for supplies. It was during one of those nights, just past 3 a.m., that Emily found herself walking alone through the basement corridor. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum as she carried a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, using its flashlight because the overhead bulbs flickered constantly. The further she walked, the colder the air became. She kept telling herself it was just the outdated ventilation, but then she heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps behind her. When she turned, The hallway was empty, but when she raised her phone's light again, she noticed something strange. The reflection in the glass window beside her showed a second figure walking just behind her. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She whipped her head around, but the hallway was empty, just her and the flickering lights overhead. Slowly, she turned back toward the glass window. Her reflection stood there as it should, but there was no mistaking it. A tall, shadowy figure loomed behind her reflection, standing only a few feet back. She spun again. Still nothing. The air felt heavier now, cold enough to make her skin prickle. She forced herself to keep walking, muttering under her breath that she was just tired, that her mind was playing tricks. But every step she took was matched by another, soft, deliberate, and just far enough behind her to make her blood run cold. Emily's pace quickened. Her sneakers squeaked against the floor as she reached the double doors that led to the supply room. She shoved them open and hurried inside, slamming them shut behind her. The storage room was cramped, lined with shelves stacked with boxes of gloves, masks, and unused equipment. She leaned against the door, trying to calm her breathing. That's when she noticed it. One of the rolling gurneys in the corner was moving, slowly, back and forth, as if someone invisible was pushing it. Emily's stomach lurched. She backed away, fumbling for her phone to call another nurse upstairs. But when she raised the screen to her ear, she saw the reflection again, this time in the glossy surface of the phone itself. The shadowy figure was standing directly behind her. She spun around so fast she nearly dropped the phone, but the room was empty. Heart hammering, she bolted toward the shelves, grabbing the supplies she needed, and rushing back to the door. Her fingers trembled as she pushed it open, praying she wouldn't see anything waiting on the other side. The hallway was silent, empty, but the second she stepped through, the overhead lights all down the corridor flickered off, one by one, until she was left standing in total darkness. Emily's phone light shook in her hand as she raised it, sweeping the beam across the walls. That's when she saw them. Footprints. Bare, wet footprints smeared across the floor, leading from the supply room deeper into the basement hall. They weren't hers. Panic clawed at her chest as she broke into a sprint, racing toward the stairwell at the far end. Her sneakers pounded against the floor, but no matter how fast she moved, she could hear it. The slow, steady footsteps behind her. Closer, louder, matching her every move. She finally burst through the stairwell door, slamming it shut behind her. But just before it closed completely, she swore she felt it. A cold breath against the back of her neck. Emily's heart pounded as she clutched the stairwell railing, trying to catch her breath. The door at the bottom of the stairs loomed behind her, its tiny wired glass window dark. She waited, straining her ears for any sound, but the basement was silent again. Too silent. She forced herself to climb, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the concrete steps. Each footfall echoed, bouncing up the stairwell. But halfway up, a new sound joined hers. Another set of footsteps. They were heavier, slower, and they weren't coming from below. They were coming from above. Emily froze, her stomach twisting. She looked up toward the landing, her phone light trembling in her hand. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated a pair of wet, bare footprints leading down the stairs toward her. She stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. The prints were fresh, glistening as though someone had just stepped there seconds ago. Swallowing hard, she turned and ran back down toward the basement door. Her trembling fingers gripped the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked again and again, her breath growing more frantic with each pull. Then, a loud bang erupted against the door, as if someone on the other side had slammed their fist into it. The sound reverberated through the stairwell, rattling the metal frame. Emily shrieked and backed away, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The overhead light flickered, buzzing angrily, then went out completely. The stairwell was plunged into total blackness. In that suffocating silence, she heard it again, breathing, deep, rasping breaths, impossibly close, though she couldn't see a thing. Emily lifted her phone flashlight with a shaking hand. The weak beam lit only a few steps ahead. Nothing. She turned slowly, sweeping the light up the stairs. At first there was nothing, just the wet footprints leading down. But then, at the top, landing, something moved. A tall figure, impossibly thin, was crouched on all fours. Its face pressed against the railing as it peered down at her. Its pale skin glistened as though soaked in water, and its wide, lidless eyes locked onto hers. Emily's scream tore through the stairwell as the figure scrambled down the stairs at an inhuman speed, limbs jerking unnaturally. She bolted back to the basement door, throwing her full weight against it, until it finally gave way, swinging open violently. She sprinted into the hall, not daring to look back, but she could hear it, the wet slap of bare feet chasing her, closer and closer. Emily's lungs burned as she reached the elevator at the end of the hall. She slammed the button repeatedly, begging it to open. The ding of the arriving car nearly made her sob in relief. She jumped inside, hitting the button for the main floor. As the doors slid shut, she saw it one last time. The figure standing just outside the elevator, dripping water onto the floor, smiling with a mouth far too wide. The doors closed. But the last thing she heard before the elevator began to rise was a whisper, low and guttural, seeping into her ears like a hiss. "You don't belong here." When the elevator doors opened onto the main floor, Emily sprinted out, startling the security guard at the desk. She tried to explain, stumbling over her words, but the guard just stared at her, like she had lost her mind. Her scrubs were damp with sweat, her eyes wide and bloodshot, and her voice cracked as she insisted there was someone in the basement. 2 orderlies went down to check. They returned 15 minutes later, shaking their heads. The basement was empty. No wet footprints. No gurney moving on its own. Nothing. But when Emily demanded they check the stairwell, one of the orderlies frowned. The overhead light had burned out completely. The bulb shattered on the floor, and smeared across the wall in what looked like dirty water were streaks. Long, uneven drag marks that led from the top landing all the way down to the basement door. Emily quit her job a week later. She couldn't bring herself to work another night shift, not after what she saw. Still, some nights when she passes by hospitals, she swears she can smell that same mildew in the air. And once, just once, while visiting a friend at a different hospital, she took the elevator down by mistake. When the doors opened to the basement level, she froze, because waiting there in the darkness was a single set of wet, bare footprints leading into the shadows. Jonas had worked the night shift at a small off-highway gas station for about 6 months. The job was simple: stock shelves, keep the register running, and wait out the long, empty hours until morning. Most nights, the biggest excitement he saw was the occasional trucker stopping in for coffee. But one Tuesday night, a little after midnight, Jonas noticed a car pull up to the far pump. It was an old sedan, the kind that looked like it hadn't passed inspection in years. The driver didn't get out right away. Instead, Jonas watched through the window as a figure sat motionless behind the wheel, headlights off, just staring at the store. Finally, the man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a long coat despite the warm night, and his face was half hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. Jonas put on his customer service smile as the man entered, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. Too slow, too deliberate. The man didn't buy gas. He didn't pick up food or drinks. He just wandered the aisles silently, hands hidden in his pockets, eyes darting toward Jonas every few seconds. After nearly 10 minutes of this, he finally approached the counter. Jonas felt a chill as the man leaned in close. "You working alone tonight?" he asked, his voice low and flat. Jonas forced a polite laugh, trying to mask the unease crawling up his spine. "Yeah, it's just me until 6. What can I get you?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stared, his pale eyes fixed on Jonas like he was studying every movement. Finally, after a few seconds too long, he muttered, "Nothing." Then he turned and walked back toward the door. The bell above it jingled as he left, and Jonas let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He tried to shake it off. Odd customers weren't unusual, especially this late, but something about that man didn't sit right. Jonas busied himself restocking shelves and sweeping the floor. 20 minutes passed. Then he glanced out the window. The old sedan was still there, parked under the broken light at the far end of the lot. The man sat inside, motionless again, facing the store. Jonas shifted uneasily, his hands tightening around the broom handle. He tried calling his manager, but it went to voicemail. He thought about dialing the police, but what could he even say? "There's a guy sitting in his car outside." They'd laugh it off. Another half hour passed. Jonas looked again. The car was gone. Relieved, he went back to the register. That relief lasted only a few minutes, until the bell above the door chimed again. The man was back. This time, he didn't wander the aisles. He walked straight up to the counter, his hands still in his coat pockets. Jonas tried to sound casual. "Forgot something?" The man leaned forward, his voice just above a whisper. "You lock your doors when you close up?" Jonas's stomach dropped. His hand instinctively slid under the counter where the emergency button was, but he hesitated, afraid to provoke him. He forced a nervous smile. "Yeah, it's company policy." The man's lips twitched into the faintest smile. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back out. The sedan roared to life, headlights cutting across the empty lot as it pulled onto the road. Jonas stood frozen for a long moment before finally relaxing. Maybe it was over. Maybe the guy was just some weirdo passing through. But at 3:10 a.m., just as Jonas started brewing a fresh pot of coffee, the headlights returned. The sedan rolled slowly back into the lot, parking at the same pump as before. This time, the man didn't get out. He just sat there, engine idling, staring at the station. Jonas tried not to look, but every time his eyes drifted toward the window, he could see that pale face behind the glass, illuminated by the dashboard lights. Hours stretched on, the car never moving, the man never leaving. Jonas began to feel trapped, like prey being watched. By 4 a.m., he knew he couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the phone and dialed the police. But just as the dispatcher answered, the bell above the door chimed again. Jonas nearly dropped the phone. The man had come back inside. He stood just a few feet from the counter now, his long coat hanging loose, his hands still buried deep in his pockets. The old sedan sat abandoned outside, its headlights still glowing. Jonas tried to steady his voice as the dispatcher asked what the emergency was. Yeah, I think someone's harassing me at my job." The man smiled faintly, as though he knew exactly what Jonas was saying. He leaned closer, whispering just loud enough for Jonas to hear over the phone. "You shouldn't have called them." Jonas's stomach turned cold. "He's inside right now," he whispered frantically into the phone. "Please, just send someone." The man tilted his head. Then, slowly, he pulled his right hand out of his coat. Jonas tensed, expecting a weapon, but it was empty. The stranger placed his palm flat on the counter, tapping his fingers rhythmically, 5 times, then stopping. His eyes never blinked. The dispatcher told Jonas to stay calm. Officers were on the way, but Jonas couldn't calm down. His knees felt weak as the stranger leaned in closer and said, "You're all alone out here, aren't you?" Then, without warning, he turned and walked away. The bell above the door jingled, and the man disappeared into the night. Jonas was left trembling behind the counter, clutching the phone to his ear. The dispatcher asked if he was safe. He nodded instinctively, then realized she couldn't see him. "I think so," he said weakly. But when he glanced outside, his blood ran cold. The sedan was still there, only now it wasn't empty. 3 more figures sat inside, motionless, staring at the store. Jonas backed away from the counter, his chest tightening. His first thought was to lock himself in the office, but before he could move, the bell above the door chimed again. This time, all four men walked in together. They spread out slowly, each one moving down a different aisle. None of them picked up anything. None of them spoke. Jonas stood paralyzed behind the counter, his finger hovering over the emergency button. And then, from the back of the store, one of the men whispered, almost sing-song, "We'll wait." The others laughed softly, low, chilling chuckles that echoed in the aisles. Jonas slammed his hand on the panic button, his pulse racing as the silent alarm triggered. The men froze, their smiles widening. One by one, they turned toward him, their pale faces catching the fluorescent light. And then, as if on cue, every single one of them started walking toward the counter. Jonas stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as the four men closed in. The sound of their shoes against the tile echoed through the store, deliberate and in sync, like they had rehearsed it. The dispatcher's voice was still faintly audible from the phone he had dropped on the counter, asking if he was safe. But Jonas couldn't move, couldn't speak. He could only watch as the men stopped just a few feet away, their smiles unnervingly wide. Then, without a word, they all turned at the same time and walked out. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the sedan's headlights flared as the engine started. Jonas stood frozen as the car pulled slowly out of the lot and disappeared down the dark highway. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed across the windows. Two officers rushed inside, hands on their holsters. Jonas tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a frantic mess, but the store was empty. The lot outside was barren. One of the officers assured him they'd keep an eye out, but they couldn't do much without plates or a clear description. They left him alone, the hum of the store lights filling the silence once more. Jonas never finished that shift. He quit the next morning, leaving the keys on the counter for his boss to find. But sometimes, late at night, when he's driving home from his new job, he swears he sees it. An old sedan in his rearview mirror, headlights off, keeping its distance, always watching.